hope you had a great 4th of July. And hey, USC with more fireworks on the recruiting trail. Booby Feaster, like that was another splash. And I think as I ask you for your opinion on this, you talked about Mark Bowman as not just another tight end, right? Like this could be a generational player. Could be really significant, not just in terms of meeting needs, but like we're talking special high-end talent. I'm getting the sense, like just so everyone knows here, before we come on the air, we discuss what we're going to talk about, how we're going to go about our business. All right, like we do kind of talk shop just so that we're kind of a little bit prepared here, right? Professionalism and all that. But we did not talk on the air specifically about Booby Feaster. We talked about that we were going to discuss him on the show, but we did not have an extended dialogue. Yet, Ethan, I get the sense you think he's another one of these generational players. And again, like some recruits just seem to create a much bigger splash than others. Booby Feaster seems to be in that category. Am I correct?
I think you are. I mean, part of the reason why Booby Feaster is going to get a lot of attention is just because he has a very silly nickname. I mean, let's, address the elephant in the room. He's another guy named Ethan, and yet he chooses to go by Booby. So interesting choice there. But that's just kind of how they do it in Texas, I think. But yeah, I mean, so he's always going to get that extra amount of attention because of his nickname. I think, every time he's in a highlight, there's going to be people going off in the comments on social media like, is that really his name? Is that really his name? Like, it's never going to get old with the social media people, probably. But he's, it's not just name value. It's not just a guy who you can market well, who's, going to pair well with the USC market. He is a very good football player. He's a top 10 wide receiver in the nation. Depending on where you look, I've seen him as high as number 4. Sometimes around number 7, regardless, top 10 wide receiver in the nation. That's pretty undisputed. And he's, 6'1", I think like around 180 pounds. So he has the size to play like any of the wide receiver positions, very fluid guy. And just also, I always feel good about prospects from Texas just because of the way that they run Texas high school football. I mean, it's just such a big thing over there. You're used to playing in front of big fan bases. You're used to, it just being such a way of life down there, football kind of being in your blood, that kind of thing. So I think that's a good sign as well. Overall, I mean, yeah, it's just another big get, especially like you said, paired with Mark Bowman. That's kind of a thought that I had. You brought his name up. I was going to bring his name up as well. The more names you bring in, the more it benefits all of these individuals. I mean, Booby Feaster would be a great wide receiver regardless of where he played and regardless of, who's playing alongside him. But playing alongside Mark Bowman, I mean, that's going to open things up for him even more. And same with Mark Bowman having things open up with Booby Feaster, that kind of thing. So, I mean, you're just seeing now, like, it being some of these rooms get developed, and the wide receiver room is obviously one of the rooms that USC fans are most interested in, one of the most exciting position rooms on a football roster. So, yeah, I mean, just really, really excited to see those developments. And you're going to need a couple of receivers to replace what Mekhi Lemon and Jacoby Lane bring too, I think. So all around, just everyone's excited. Cool that the news came on the 4th of July too. I saw that his graphic had some fireworks in it. I could probably pull it up for our viewers to see here. Because I always have it on hand. Here we go. Yeah. Hayes Fawcett did another incredible job there on that, but yeah, so it's all exciting. Everybody's excited. And he's, like I said, going to be super marketable too. The name value just speaks for itself for sure. I think you're muted, Matt. Sorry.
I think a natural follow-up question with Booby Feaster is, USC has Jaden Mayava, and then, next year there's an expectation that Husan Longstreet, will at least be in contention for QB1. And one of the discussion points that always comes up with quarterbacks and receivers, and that we saw this in a very clear way last year at USC, is that some quarterbacks just click with certain receivers. The relationship, the rapport is just more fluid. It works and it doesn't work quite as much with others. And Miller Moss was just unwilling to trust his receivers. I'm not even saying it's a bad thing. I'm just calling it for what it is, as a fact, as a reality. Miller Moss did not trust his receivers to win 50-50 balls. Miller Moss was, thinking about, how do I make the percentage play, the percentage throw? But it got to a point where he just wasn't going to throw jump balls, let your receiver go up and get it. There are some times when you don't want to be throwing jump balls, where you have either your offense is humming, or like you're displaying physical superiority. You don't need to risk a certain throw. But there are other times when, you do need to trust your receiver to make a play. So it's case by case. But anyway, to underscore the point, Ethan, as you can sense, that the relationship USC receivers had with Jaden Maiava was very different from Miller Moss. So with Booby Feaster coming in, and you mentioned Mark Bowman as well, do you have any kind of early sense of, hey, they might fit Maiava in these ways, they might fit Husan Longstreet in these ways? Any sense of how the pieces of the puzzle are going to fit in the 2026 USC passing game? What's your early sense? Obviously, it's a year in advance. And then, we're in this weird spot where USC's recruiting next year has us all looking ahead a year while we have 2025. But this is still the big story until summer camp gets going, or until Big Ten Media Days get going. This is still the big story around USC. So what's your early sense of how the 2026 passing game might come together in terms of the relationships between the USC quarterbacks and these incoming pass catchers?
Well, I think if, when you pitch Mark Bowman and you pitch Booby Feaster USC, you're ultimately pitching them Hassan Longstreet. So I'd assume that Lincoln Riley is kind of bridging, those relationships together, is really pointing towards Hassan Longstreet as like, hey, this is our guy in the future. Like, this is the guy you'll be spending the majority of your college career, partnering up with on the offensive side of the ball. So I would assume that is more of a fit that's being looked at than Maiava, just generally, because, even if Maiava stays another year, it's not like he's, you still have 2 more years of them playing with Hassan Longstreet as their quarterback. So, even in that kind of situation, you still, like I would, more heavily want to merge them with Hassan than with Jaden Maiava. But I do think, skills wise as well, Booby Feaster matches up well with Hassan Longstreet, just because he's more of a even more of an established dual threat quarterback. And I believe he's known to have a little bit of a bigger arm than Maiava, and Booby Feaster is kind of more of a traditional speedster. Mark Bowman I could see working well with Maiava, just because Maiava, at his best, takes some good risks and throws some of those 50-50 balls. And we talked about how big and strong Mark Bowman is and how good of a route runner he is, and how he can fight really some of those guys in the secondary for some of those 50-50 balls and that kind of thing. But I would think, when you're looking at Hassan Longstreet, you're looking at getting back to more of that traditional Lincoln Riley style offense that we saw with Caleb Williams, because you really want to really want to lean into his dual threat ability. And so, and that being, the pairing of him being a runner, but also having a really big arm, Maiava's shown both, but he's still raw. And I wouldn't say that he's, as good at either one as Caleb Williams was. So I think for me, that makes Booby Feaster and Hassan Longstreet a more natural match than him with Maiava. But Maiava is still dual threat, and we've seen him do things with both his arms and his legs. So if he's around, again, it could work. But I do think, regardless, like I said, you're pitching these receivers to Hassan Longstreet because that's who they're going to be with for the majority of their career here anyway.
As this USC roster takes shape for 2026, we've mostly been talking about the defensive side of the ball, because you have an established, proven coordinator Danton Lynn, and you have these excellent, highly regarded position coaches, Coach Henney, woof woof, dog work, Rob Ryan, Doug Belk. And so, like, most of the action, not all, but most, has been on the defensive side. And Jeff Rodriguez, one of the friends of the program, frequent viewer, he's regularly in the chat. He wanted my quick take on Boobie last week. This was before the commitment was official. We recorded the show on Thursday, July 3rd. But he wanted to ask me, hey, assuming USC lands the commitment, which it did about 24 hours later, what do you think the importance of Booby Feaster would mean? And I told Jeff, most of the 2026 action's been on defense. Now you're getting another splash on offense. You're creating a more well-rounded roster. Any other additional insights, Ethan, in terms of how you think this 2026 roster is really taking shape? It's a year out, and these are just recruiting ratings that we have to wait a long time to see this potential become actualized. But from this early vantage point, what's your sense of how the full 2026 roster is really filling out, and how Booby Feaster fits into that picture?
I think you mentioned the defense. I think they've been pursuing a lot of big physical guys. I think names like Luke Wafel and Keeney Pepe come to mind as two of honestly the bigger commitments. Mark Bowman is probably the biggest prospect, but then those guys were like, Keeney Pepe was the headliner for a while. Luke Wafel was another really, really big name. And those are obviously massive, massive guys. Keeney Pepe is 6'7", 325. Luke Wafel's 6'5", 255. They're really building up the kind of size that you need in the Big Ten for sure. Tawanoa Ili is really big for a linebacker at 6'3", 210. There's just size all over this class. And that's not necessarily one of like Booby Feaster's like real standout traits. 6'1", 175, that's not, insane, but still, it's not like he's 5'9", and 125 pounds soaking wet or anything like that. Like, he's still, professional sized wide receiver. So I think the physical traits of this class really do stand out to me, because their talent is obviously something you always want to recruit, but what you can't teach size. And it feels like even if these guys don't live up to their 5-star potential per se, they're still big, physical, professional, like almost NFL sized guys already. So at least you're plugging in guys who at least look the part and have the physical acumen. And then it doesn't feel like as much of a boom or bust situation. Like, even if they don't live up to their full potential, at least they're big guys. They're guys that can throw the other guys in the Big Ten around, and they can kind of impose their will a little bit physically, even if their skills don't develop the way people think they will.
One of the frustrations of last season, as you know well, as the USC fan base knows well, is that Zachariah Branch just wasn't able to really take off and lift his game to the next level. There's so much raw talent there. It just didn't happen. It just didn't click. And we've seen this in a number of USC skill position players. Also running backs as well. Just electric, natural talent. Like, you could get a glimpse of the potential, but didn't fully come together. As we contemplate Booby Feaster, are we looking at someone that we can feel pretty solid about in terms of actualizing potential? Obviously, nothing's guaranteed in this game, right? You just can't say it's an automatic slam dunk. But I think a lot of USC fans would certainly be interested in getting a sense of, all right, on a scale of Zachariah Branch to Jordan Addison, or let's say Mario Williams, who was a bust, or Dorian Singer, who also was a bust. to, on the other side, someone like Taj Washington, who really did maximize his potential on a scale of, bust to, superstar. Any early sense of like what a reasonable expectation looks like for Booby Feaster at USC?
Reasonable expectation is a tricky question. I think something that stands out to me is Booby Feaster is obviously bigger than Zachariah Branch, which again goes back to my earlier point. Zachariah Branch was very skilled, very fast, very exciting, made some of those exciting plays in the return game, his first couple of games in the 2023 season, but is just not big and just didn't seem to have the hands. He had so many drops, and that was the most frustrating thing about him, was he just couldn't hold on to the football at all. So I think with Booby Feaster, you're getting somebody who, again, he's at least bigger. He's not going to shrink next to some of these Big Ten defenders. He's not going to get popped by them and drop the ball and stuff like that. He's got a little bit more size on him, a couple extra pounds, a couple extra inches, and but he's still known for being very fast and very smooth and very dynamic. And I think I think reasonable expectation now. It's hard for me to predict for him just because he's so young. He's going to be 17 years old as a college freshman, so he's got a lot of years before he develops into hopefully what he ultimately turns into before he gets drafted. I think he's more of a candidate for a guy to spend 4 years instead of 3 years, unless he has a remarkable 3 years. It's possible that he goes and gets drafted to the NFL at 20 years old. It's possible, or 19 or whatever. But I think he is more of a candidate than someone like, say, Mark Bowman to stay an extra year. And I think by that point, you're looking at. If the ranking shows to be true, he'll be that superstar guy, that over 1,000-yard guy. I think the first couple of years, 2026, 2027, a comparison that pops into my mind is Brendan Rice, just because I think Brendan Rice in 2023 especially didn't have the, necessarily the consistent years, but he surely was still one of the more reliable USC wide receivers in a really down year for USC wide receivers. And he was a real big play home run hitter. When the rest of the offense was just looking like a shell of itself compared to the year before, he was still scoring a lot of touchdowns, even though he didn't have a ton of yards. I think he had like somewhere in the 600-yard range, but 11 touchdowns, if I'm remembering off the top of my head correctly. So I'd assume, as he's a little bit more raw, he's still going to have the big play potential, and he's still big enough and established enough and, develop enough of a prospect that he's not going to disappear. So even I think his floor is like not floor, but his reasonable middle ground is someone like Brendan Rice, especially these first couple of years.
Well, given his youth, I think that's something to underscore here, that, that the first year might be a bit of a developmental year. And then the second year, after you've kind of soaked up knowledge and you've put on some pounds, you've grown in size a little bit, for a guy this young, that might be important to keep in mind, that right out of the gate, we might not see it all come together, but in year two, big leap, and then in a third year could be an all-timer at USC. But of course, we shall